name is Andrew Charlton, and I have the honour of representing both myself and Charles Stotler from Aviation Advocacy in the University of Mississippi, talking about the implications of the coronavirus, specifically on the aviation industry, a very specific part of the tourism industry, of course, but a very fundamental part of the tourism industry. I'd like to thank the Institute for giving us the opportunity to talk about these things today. I think this is a great initiative, and I hope that we can learn quite a lot from talking with each other. I think there are a few things that we need to note at the start of this. The first is, of course, that the current situation is not necessarily going to be the same into the long term, by which I mean, frankly, that I believe personally that it will get worse before it gets better. Airlines will continue to find it very difficult to operate services. There will be significantly fewer services, and that ultimately will have an enormous impact on the financing and the finances of airlines and of aviation more generally. And that sounds a little bit pessimistic, it sounds a little bit depressing, but I don't think it needs to be, because in fact we have the opportunity, if we want to take an optimistic view, to come back and to try to change some of the problems that have developed over the last 75 or so years since modern commercial aviation started. And I think that's quite a good place to start, in fact, in our analysis, because during the war, there was no commercial aviation, and that's almost exactly the place we're at now. There was a little bit of repatriation flying, there was a little bit of cargo flying, but in effect, the war was the opportunity, World War II was the opportunity for the airline industry to sit down and to redesign its entire structures. And I think we have the possibility to think about those sorts of things again. That said, I think there are probably 4 different scenarios from where we go from here, or where we end up from here. The first one is that for some reason, vaccines are found, aviation is able to open up, we're able to fly again, and all of the money that's been poured into the various airlines around the world, whether in the United States, in Europe, in Asia, in Australia, mean that the airlines can emerge from this, and the airports can emerge from this, and indeed the air navigation service providers, which are, of course, are the entire ecosystem of airlines or of aviation, emerge from this and just get back to doing what they've been doing anyway. That's the business as usual scenario. To be very frank with you, I have to rate that as a very low chance, because I think that every day that goes on, it gets more and more difficult to think we just go back to doing business as usual, to say that everything's fine again and now we're all okay. I also think if we do that, and if we keep insisting on that, we are going to, frankly, let this crisis go to waste. Because with all the best goodwill in the world, there are things in the aviation industry that we could change, and we could change as a matter of some urgency, and we could change for the better. So I think if that's where we land, that will be sad at some levels. It will be unfortunate. So the second option, I think, the second scenario, if you like, and we've put in our paper, is that there are going to be some changes, but none of them totally fundamental. I think there are a few things to note about that. The first one, of course, is that for the foreseeable future, there will be fewer flights, there will be fewer airlines, which I think means ultimately there will be fewer airlines. As a matter of fact, the requirements for social distancing will mean that, for example, every second seat on the aeroplane will be empty, which then makes you wonder why you'd have big aeroplanes. Why would you fly 777s? Why would you fly A350s? Why fly 200 or 150 empty seats around? There will be some changes in that regard. I also think that if there are fewer flights and ultimately fewer airlines, then we land back at a place where the airport's business model is also now completely broken, because if the fewer flights and the consolidation of airlines, both within Europe, perhaps within Asia, or in a really great way, if we were able to change the ownership and control rules, I'll talk about that in scenario 4. If we get to that place, the airport's current business model, which is to encourage more airlines to come and fly to their airport, doesn't work because there are fewer airlines. Other changes we could eventually perhaps or push the air navigation service providers to more quickly uptake the new technology. Remember that at the moment we control aeroplanes with VHF radio and radar, which is straight out of World War II, and that's crazy. And we could go to satellite-based surveillance, satellite-based communication, and move forward down those sorts of roads and really improve the quality of the air navigation service providers. And we could also start to improve the relationship between the airlines and the airports, and the airlines and the ANSPs, which I think would be a marvellous thing. One of the interesting changes perhaps that would happen, or that could happen within this framework, would be if the airports took over control of the control tower. And so suddenly the airports would be able to offer to airlines much more focused customer-centric services than they get at the moment, because the ANSPs currently take a first-come, best-dressed sort of approach, whereas if the airport was in control of the tower and the airport had one major important airline flying to it, it could start to moderate the services. We could start to put the customers towards the centre of the system, which would be a remarkable change and could happen, I think, even within the confines of the current regulatory framework. The third scenario is almost the dystopian scenario, and unfortunately I'm not prepared to dismiss it, because at the moment you would be ill-advised to think we're not going to get to it. And the third scenario would be the situation where we effectively go back to 1944 and we retreat, we give up all of the open skies and all of the other liberalisation that we've had, and we land back at a place where we've got nationalism, national borders, national carriers which have been funded by governments increasingly, including equity. We end up with state-owned airlines, state-owned ANSPs and state-owned airports, and everybody operating through very much a state-owned model, which I think would be very dangerous, and I think would be a waste of the last 25, 30 years of reform and liberalisation. It would be a tragedy, but unfortunately it's not impossible to imagine. It wouldn't be, I think, that politicians would start out demanding that we have national airlines. It's just that the nationalism and the rhetoric that they keep using at the moment, President Trump is an example, but by no means the only one, the nationalism that's being spoken about will have the inevitable impact that's where we go. And I think that would be very sad indeed, and it would be awful for the tourism industry as a general comment. So that's the dystopian vision. What would the utopian vision be? Let's start again. Let's take a blank sheet of paper. Let's make this Chicago 2, if you like. Let's renegotiate the arrangements. I genuinely believe there'll be fewer airlines. That already means that we need to think about the ownership and control restrictions, which I think maybe made sense in 1944. Maybe they didn't, frankly, but maybe they did. There are good historical reasons, which we go through a little bit in the paper about that. But if we got rid of the ownership and control restrictions, if we got rid of the sovereignty restriction for air traffic control, which works perfectly when you're using radar to do your surveillance, but is meaningless if you're using satellites. If we got rid of those sorts of requirements, if we got rid of the vertical separation, I think we'd be in a much better place. So I think we could get rid of that. We could start to see single international airlines. We call them international airlines at the moment. They're not. They're national airlines that sometimes fly to another country. If we ended up with international airlines that had a series of hubs around its global network and a network-focused delivery, that would bring the air navigation service provider into each airline. They could look at a single provider of air traffic control services based in their network operations centre, driving efficient delivery, working with the airports that they use for their network. And we end up perhaps with 30 airlines that around the world. And if you think, oh gosh, 30 airlines, that'd be a disaster, because what we'd then see is monopoly powers. Let me say in response to that one thing, which is that the barriers to entry at the moment to start an airline are enormous. In the future, that may not be the case. There will be airframes available, there will be crew available, there will be gates available, There will be slots available. I think it'll be a lot easier for an entrepreneur or an innovative person to come in with a new airline anyway. So they are the four sort of scenarios we've sketched out. I'd be delighted to continue this conversation with you, and I thank you for your attention.